Wait, okay. I'm going to share a song with you. So, but it's an old song, so it shouldn't be a copyright issue. So I thought we would sing one verse in the chorus of "Angels We Have Heard on High." And if you don't know the words to the verse, it's okay, but join in with the chorus because I know you know that part. Angels we have heard on high, sweetly singing o'er the plains, and the mountains in reply, echoing their joyous strains. Gloria in excelsis Deo, Gloria in excelsis Deo. Shepherds, why this jubilee? Why your joyous strains prolong? What the gladsome tidings be, which inspire your heavenly song? Gloria in excelsis Deo. Gloria in excelsis Deo. Thank you. You know what that means, right? Glory to God in the highest is what that means. So, my message isn't a Christmas message in any traditional way, but I'll get there, sort of. So, I'm going to talk about a character from the Hebrew scriptures. I know you've heard about her before many times, but I think I have a little different take on her. And it just really spoke to me this week. So I'm going to talk about Ruth. Remember Ruth and Naomi? Everybody remembers part of that story. I'm going to refresh you in case you forgot some of it. And the reason I wanted to talk about Ruth, because I've been thinking about all the people in our lives and in our world and in some of our own lives who are facing such a huge chasm of unknown. What is going to happen? How am I going to get through this? Whatever that is for you or for so many people in this world. How am I going to get through this? And I know millions and millions of people today are wondering that same thing. And some of us maybe also. So let me refresh you about Ruth. It was maybe 1,500, 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. Don't know exactly when to date this. And it's probably not strictly a historical event, but something like this probably happened. So Ruth, so we back up. The two people that we always hear about when we hear about Ruth are Naomi and Ruth. And Naomi was her mother-in-law. Now let me back up and let us remind ourselves how that happened. Many years prior to that, Ruth and her husband and many of the people that we would now call Jewish, they didn't call themselves Jewish at that point, but many of the people that we would now call Jewish who worshiped the God, the Yahweh of Abraham and Isaac, their lands were devastated by famine, and the people and the crops and the animals were dying, and it was a very lengthy period of suffering for people and not having enough to be able to manage. So a lot of the Jewish folks moved to what we call Moab. And you've heard Ruth referred to as the Moabitess, the Moabite woman. Now, what's important to understand about the Moabites, I mean, there's many things, it's wonderful, and they were apparently welcomed. Many of the Moabites who did not worship Yahweh God welcomed these Jewish settlers because they knew their lands and their crops and their lives were in such jeopardy. So a lot of these Jewish folks were apparently welcomed into this other land that didn't acknowledge Yahweh God, which is a lesson for all of the world these days anyway, to welcome people that don't believe the same way we do. So that had happened sometime earlier. And so Ruth and her husband had moved to Moab. And they apparently had done very well, and they had children. And wait a minute, I've got it backwards. Hold on a minute. I got it backwards. I do this sometimes. It wasn't. It was Naomi's family that were the Jewish folks that worshiped Yahweh God. It's easy sometimes when you don't have notes written down. Anyway, Naomi and her husband and their 2 sons moved to this other area. Naomi's husband died. We don't know any details. Like I said, I don't think this is based on a strictly historical, factual family. I think it's based on things that happened to people at that time. But Naomi and her husband died. I mean, Naomi's husband died. Their 2 sons were okay, and they took wives from Moab. So Ruth and her sister-in-law, Orpah, Orpah, were not Jewish. They worshipped different beings. And then the 2 sons died. So Naomi is a widow of some senior age, and she's got 2 daughters-in-law that are living with her, both of whom are also widows. We got three widows living together in a time and a culture when widows were pretty much considered scum. They were not treated right, and that's still true in a lot of parts of the world. So what are they going to do? I mean, it was a life-threatening situation for all 3 of these women to not have husbands, to not have sons. Because as you know, the women were considered property, only less than most property. The women were considered to not have any worth whatsoever without a man. So it was a life-threatening situation for these 3 folks. And Naomi says to her 2 daughters-in-law, "You go back to your families, and I'm going to return to my homeland, Israel. And you go back to your families here in Moab. and we'll all try to do the best we can. Now, these three women by this point had become very, very close. They loved each other. And one can only imagine the amount of fear and loneliness and anguish all of them had gone through. I mean, it's bad enough anytime for someone to lose their life partner, but for a woman in those times to lose her husband was pretty much a death sentence. So they had all struggled and struggled for some time trying to figure out how to survive. And so Naomi said, "You two, I love you so much. You're my family and I love you so much, but I can't take care of you. You need to go back to your parents, and I'm going to go back to my homeland that I haven't been to in decades." And remember that there was many tears and crying and weeping and hugging and trying to figure out what to do between the three of them. And the one sister, the one daughter-in-law, Orpah, finally agreed that she would go back to her family, that somehow she would be taken care of by her parents or somebody in her family. And Ruth said, "No, I can't leave. I have to go with you. Naomi, my mother now, I have to go with you. I cannot be separated from you. I love you too much." And so there was this conversation back and forth between Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And Naomi begged Ruth, begged her, pleaded with her to go back to her own family in Moab. And Ruth said no. And remember, there's this wonderful quotation from the scriptures of Ruth that many of us have heard in weddings. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And remember, Ruth came from a tradition that didn't even know Yahweh God. So this was a really big thing for Ruth to say that. I'm gonna go someplace where I've never been, to a culture I've never been to live with people whose practices are completely different from anything I've ever known. But I love Naomi as much or more than my own mother, and I cannot bear to be separated from her. So I'm going to go with her, no matter what. So that's what happened. Naomi and Ruth said goodbye to the other daughter-in-law. And Naomi and Ruth started trudging out to go, I don't know how many miles, I don't know how far it was, but it was a major journey with barely any kind of provisions, with no one to help them, no one to keep them safe. And eventually they arrived back in Naomi's hometown, and people didn't even recognize her because she had aged so much from stress and grief and fear and just this massive journey that they had undertaken. And certainly they didn't recognize Naomi, and they had no idea who this other woman was with her, who was with her. Who was she? So talk about people facing the unknown and trying to just get through it. Naomi and Ruth were facing huge unknown situations that could have been quite tragic, but they did it. And we don't know at what point, but obviously at some point, Ruth truly embraced the spiritual traditions of Naomi and began to hold in her heart this sense of relationship with God. So Naomi kind of took the role of a man in that culture, because she did some things that a woman wouldn't have done, and it wouldn't have been considered acceptable for a woman to do. But she was so concerned about Ruth that she decided she was going to make this happen to help Ruth survive. And somehow, and remember, Naomi had been apart from her family and her community for a long time by that point. She somehow realized that there was a man that lived in this community that was a very distant relative of her deceased husband. So she somehow managed to enable Ruth to try to meet this man. I mean, because it's not the role of a woman in that culture to introduce another woman to anybody, and certainly not a man. But she realized that maybe she could help this happen, and she knew that this man, whose name was Boaz, that he had an excellent reputation. He was wealthy, he had crops, he had people that worked for him, and he had an excellent reputation as a person of kindness and grace and dignity. And even though he was several years, probably several decades older than Ruth, she thought that Moab might be willing to take care of her daughter-in-law Ruth. So this gets a little iffy there in the translation of what that says happened. But at any rate, Ruth was going out every day into the fields of whatever kind of crop it was, wheat or something, barley, and it was acceptable for widowed women to go do this at the end of the workday and try to gather up anything that was left over, because, like I said, the women that were widowed didn't have any source of taking care of themselves, of feeding themselves. And so it was acceptable, at least for Moab, it was acceptable for these women to go into his fields and take some of the stuff that was still left that wasn't gathered up. And he even told his workers, don't take everything, leave some leftovers so that these women can survive, and let them take this. So that gives you an idea of his character. So Ruth was doing that, and she went back and told her mother-in-law, Naomi, that she had been able to get a lot of barley that they could make bread with, that they could make soup with, that they could eat. And she said, and the owner of the fields even helped me and gave me a whole lot of extra for us. So Naomi had this idea that she would help Ruth and Boaz. Am I confusing you? It's a complicated story. She would help Ruth and Boaz somehow see if they might like to be together. And I'm just going to leave it at that, because I don't know what happened, but I assure you it was on the up and up. But so Boaz notices this beautiful young woman who's clearly a widow, clearly from another culture, and he thinks, I think I would like to be with this woman. We've never heard of that, right? An older man seeing a younger woman and thinking that might be a good partner for me. Never heard of it. It's completely different time and culture. So here's what happened, and here's the part where it gets even more confusing. Remember that Naomi's husband had died by this point a few years earlier. And technically it was to be Naomi's brother-in-law, her husband's brother, was the one who was supposed to take over to take care of this widowed woman. But apparently there wasn't a brother-in-law to take over. So Boaz thought, I, I would like to marry this young woman, Ruth. But he knew that he wasn't the next in line. It's supposed to be the closest living relative to the deceased husband. And Naomi didn't have any other close relatives. So Boaz went around into this community where they lived, and he started questioning the other people that he knew were distant relatives. And they didn't want to do it because that would obligate them financially to take on somebody else to support. And if they did that, they might jeopardize their own future financially. So he couldn't find somebody who wanted to be involved with this foreign woman. And Naomi came up with a plan of how Ruth would be able somehow to suggest to Boaz that she was interested in him, and it worked. And then we know what happened. They married and had a child. Well, here's the thing, among many. For such a short little portion of our scriptures, this is a complicated story that honestly, just reading it from the scriptures, it's hard to figure it out. You kind of have to go and look at, I did anyway, many times, go and look at other references to try to figure it all out, who was what and what was going on. So Ruth marries Boaz, this much older man, but before they get married, he had already told other potential suitors for Ruth about the fact that that person that married her would be responsible for her. But when Boaz married Ruth, he said, I am not going to take your inheritance from you. I am not going to be legally the father of our child because I don't want you to lose your inheritance that you would have had from your husband. And then the frequently in the translations that we have, the word used is a redeemer. The redeemer is the one that keeps this widowed woman from being completely not just bankrupt, but that her son is still the inheritor of Ruth's deceased husband. I know that sounds very strange. What that also meant was that Boaz was saying, your son will not be taking my name. Your son is the son of you and your deceased husband and has all the rights from your deceased husband. And you have, by virtue of being the widow, you have those financial and legal and emotional connections. Does that make sense? Sort of. It was a very odd thing to happen, and it's the only place I know of in the scriptures where this kind of thing even. Anyway, well, here's the thing. So I started off by telling you I wanted to talk to you about Ruth because of all of the places in her life where she faced roadblocks that just seemed unsurpassable. And she just kept on and kept on and kept on. And she had already, and she lived up to it, she had already said to her dear mother in law, remember, she said, your God will be my God. So she had become a, a spiritual believer in Yahweh God and became faithful to that, which also would have been important to her new husband, Boaz. And all of that's a wonderful, wonderful story. Now we get back to Christmas. So at the end of this little tiny book of Ruth, there's a genealogy. And I know most of us don't pay any attention to genealogies because they're just a pain. So and so beget, so and beget, so and so what, right? And most of the time, the genealogies that we have in our scriptures are at the very beginning, and we just kind of skip over them. And in this little tiny section of scripture, the genealogy is at the very end. So you can skip over that too if you'd like, but you're going to miss something really critical. Because eventually, if you read the short genealogy, Ruth's son was connected to King David. So what that means is Ruth's son was an ancient relative of the Christ. Talk about a surprising ending. All of the things that happened to Ruth culminated in this remarkable inheritance. And I think there's many lessons for us in that, because there's so many times, maybe now for some of us, we don't know how we're going to figure it out, how to get to wherever it is we think we need to get. We don't even know where we think we need to get sometimes. And we forget that holiness is who we are if we just embrace it, if we just acknowledge and give thanks for being holy and for being loved and for being cared for in ways that we can't even imagine. And I think that's the real lesson of Ruth. That's all I got to say about that. Thank you very much.